I want to start out by thanking everyone for their patience as I deal with my detached retina. I'm able to function now. For the first week or so, I wasn't really able to do much of anything. I was supposed to lay on my side almost all the time, whereas now I'm allowed to pretty much do, within reason, the normal stuff, drive, lecture, grade, and so on. That being said, it's still, my vision is still not perfect, and therefore, I might need some extra time on some things like grading and responding to you and so on. But I'll try to make the interruptions as painless as possible for everyone. All right, I want to spend a minute talking about the stuff that was covered in last week's lecture video, and go on to another example. But I want to frame it from the perspective of your Lab 3 assignment. Now, your Lab 3 assignment is to do the following. I'm doing the exact same things I did yesterday. It's uncanny. Okay. Go. All right, your Lab 3 assignment is to do the following. You're going to have a screen that looks like this. Type of coin and the number of coins. And this is going to be a drop down. And this could be a drop down. It could be the number of coins could be a text box. It could be a drop down. I suppose it could even be radio buttons. The type of coin would probably be either a drop down or a radio button. So by type of coin, I mean it's going to show pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. Is that all? Yeah. Pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. And the number of coins will be 1 through 10. So if you make it a text box, you need to validate to make sure that the value that you enter is numeric and that the value that you enter is 1 through 10. And you could do it without a submit button, but probably the easier way, at least at first, is to have a submit button. And if you type in the type of coin, let's say pennies, and you choose the number of coins 3, when you hit submit, it should show, value equals 0.03. And it should then show 3 pennies. If you then change it to something else, it should show the new values, show the new amount in the new number of coins. And there's two main aspects to this. Number one is being able to process a form. So being able to pull the values that were selected in a form and then do something with them. In this case, calculate. Do a calculation and display the number of items that we want. And the second thing is, how do we add HTML to the page? if I'm not mistaken, all of our JavaScript examples so far have been taking a web page and making changes to the CSS for that web page. All right. We're going to do something different because these three images here actually weren't there before. They shouldn't be there. It's not like they're going to be there and they're hidden or anything like that. They're not going to be there. There's going to be the section that the coins are in is going to be empty. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put those coins in that empty section. Put the HTML for the coin image in that empty section. So let's look at the example that was covered last week, see if there's any questions about it. All right. Is this the right one? So, okay. So if you work hours, let's say you work 40 hours, and your job type is trainee. Gross pay is $400. And it indicates that the data that you entered is valid. If you go and put in something that isn't valid, we get this. Invalid. I should say invalid, of course. So let's take a look at this exercise before we go further. If we look at this, now I tend to put everything in one HTML file because it's simply easier to lecture with. But again, you are, a better approach sometimes is to put the JavaScript in its own separate file. I just closed the wrong window. All right, we have a very simple thing here. And again, I'm assuming that you've already looked at the lecture, and I'm just going to hit sort of the high points. We have here a text box for hours, a radio button for the type of employee they are, and a button to do the calculation. On click, we say process form. All right. Now, process form is going to do two things. It's going to, first of all, make sure that the data entered on the form is valid. The second thing it's going to do is then, if it is valid, it's going to calculate. So notice in this example how I use multiple functions. I don't just simply have one function. Now, my screen is bigger, both because I'm lecturing and because it's tough to see for me otherwise. But notice how each function is relatively short. It should probably fit in a single screen, assuming that the window was maximized and you had a normal resolution. So let's look here at process form. It validates the form. If it's valid, that's what this means. If the validate form function returns true, it's going to do this. Otherwise, it's going to do that. What does validate form do? Well, it looks and it finds these different elements on the screen using get element by ID. First thing it does is it clears out the error section from anything that was in there before. So if you entered valid data, then entered invalid data, you don't want to check mark N and X. You just want the second X. We assume that the page is valid. We create a UL as our initializing the error message, and we grab the hours from the text box using getElementById. So getElementById, as we talked about before, is our workhorse. So text txt hours is the ID of that text box. We get the value for it. We trim it, which means removing leading and trailing spaces. And if there's nothing there, we say that the form is, or the form is invalid, and we concatenate an LI that says must enter hours to our error message. Notice our error message is comprised of HTML tags because that's what we want to see on our screen. We want HTML code. Otherwise, if it's not a number, we do something similar. Otherwise, if the hours are less than 0. And in all cases, we put a different error message up. Finally, we have a method that says getType. And getType simply goes in and it gets the value of type that was selected. I broke this out in a function just because we're going to do this code in several places, so you might as well make a function of it. I know it's probably not, this function probably isn't terribly meaningful, but again, I was going function crazy on this example just to show you, break down a big problem into smaller problems. And if the type is equal to nothing, then it's not valid and you must choose job type. We then close the error message tag, and if it's valid, we set the inner HTML of the errors section to the errors message. So we pop right into this errors section right here. We pop that HTML, which is an unordered list. So let's show you that in action. If I enter in nothing for job type and I enter in a negative for hours, calculate is invalid, and our unordered list shows a list of the errors that we have. This, by the way, is the best way to show errors in my mind. A lot of times students pop up alert boxes because that's nice and easy to do. Well, if you think about it, if you have a big form with 10 fields and you have 5 errors, it's a pain for the user to click through all those alert boxes. It's much better to give it to them on the screen and give them a list of things. Now, the one thing that we could do that we didn't do in this example is we could put the error right next to the field, and that's very useful as well. That's another way to do it. But show all the errors that you can detect at one time. Don't simply show the first error in an alert box or on the screen. Show all the errors so the user can correct them. All right. If we do enter in the right values, then this kicks in. Calculate results. In either case, we either display valid or invalid. Let's look at display image. Display image is taking a string for the file name of the image that we want and a string for the alt attribute of it. Here we're doing a different method than the inner HTML. We're actually creating an image element, creating an image object. And we're setting the attributes, the source object and the alt attribute. Those are the same attributes as if I just typed in this image in HTML, right? You'd have image, src equals, alt equals. So the only difference between us typing this in is we're doing this through our code, but we're still creating an image object. We then find a place on the screen that we want to put it. We remove everything that was there. That's what this little loop does. And we add that image, we append child that image to the location, which was down here. This graphic. Then if it's okay, we go and do our calculation, which is simply a matter of getting the values from the form, getting the rate. In other words, depending on the type, we have a rate. Trainees get 10, associates get 12, managers get $15 per hour. We do our calculation, and if the type is A or the type is T, then we pay them overtime. So if their hours are greater than 40, we add an extra half the wage rate for each hour exceeding 40. Questions on this? So this shows the two things that we need to do in our assignment, believe it or not. I'm not saying it shows you everything that you need to do on that assignment, but it shows you some of the key things that you need to do, how to do math using the form, and how to create HTML tags on a web page. Now, this week's example is a little different. I have here a background color and a foreground color. And we're going to change this paragraph right here. So if we type in blue and yellow, change color, and we write this message that says BG equals blue, FG equals yellow. Then we have a clear history. All right, let's take a look at that and see what's going on here. All right, the first thing that you notice is we've gotten rid of the on-click method for our buttons. Here's our two buttons, the button to change the color and the button to clear. Well, something still happens when we click on them. So that on-click event still happens, but we associate that in a different way with the HTML. And this is actually a better way to associate functions with elements of HTML. I think I showed the triangle before, how you have CSS and HTML and JavaScript. And if you can, the greater degree that you can keep those separate, better off you are. So therefore, we can create a separate CSS file that's not at all entangled with the HTML. All right. Then to change the appearance of the page, we just need to change that external CSS file. It's similar with JavaScript. We can actually start writing JavaScript code that we can reuse in other places. All right, and a good step to do that is, the good first step to do that is to get rid of the on-click event. So how do we associate it? Well, we associate it by addressing those events in our JavaScript. This first one says that when the window finishes loading, that is when the page finishes loading, that's the event that you're listening for, the load event, call the function page loaded. All right, what is that there for? That is there because if you remember, JavaScript is executed in sequence from the start of the page on down. Notice that this instruction is not in a function. So all these functions get loaded, but the code doesn't execute. This, because it's outside of a function, this will execute as the page loads. Now, if we were to do that immediately, if we were to call this function immediately, before the page was finished loading, we might be referring to things on the page that don't exist yet. All right. In other words, that button might not be created. All right. And therefore, we would try to add an event to that button, and that button doesn't exist yet, and we would get an error, and it wouldn't work. So we wait, first of all, until the page is completely loaded. That's what this does. So when the page is loaded, call this function. What does this function do? It logs here in the log we can see that if we want. There. And it does these things. So what is it doing? It's finding the change button using the ID, and then it's setting its listener to click, its click listener to change color. This one finds the clear button and changes the listener, the click listener, to clear history. So that would be the same effect of me going in here and say on click equals change color, or on click equals clear history. But it's a cleaner way to do it. It doesn't muddy up our HTML at all, and the effect is the same. Now, if this line of code doesn't exist, that here doesn't display because that code never executes. Because remember, a function doesn't execute until it's called. Here we're saying to execute that function when the page has finished loading. So we click the button to change color. What do we do? Well, we validate the form. How do we validate the form in this case? Well, we make sure that there's something in each value that is not an empty string. And we make sure that the colors are different. So for example, we can't go in and set the background color to white and the foreground color to white. Because then you wouldn't be able to see the text. But we can put in background color of get that. Now, there's no validation to make sure that I've typed in a legal color. All right. So I could type in garbage. And green. It'll change the part of it that it can change, but it'll leave the rest the same. So if these things are if either of these conditions are false, we initialize be valid as true. We space out the error messages. In this case, our error messages are right next to that. Again, this form could have been designed a little cleaner. And then we test the values. And if it's invalid, we display the inner HTML, the error message, and we then say that the form is false. All your validation is going to look like this. It's much cleaner and easier to write validation this way. Your validate form function is going to assume that the form is valid. Why is that? Because it's easier to prove that a form is not valid than to prove that it is valid. To prove the form is valid, you have to make sure everything is correct. To prove that a form is invalid, you only have to find one thing that's incorrect. So we're going to assume the form is valid. We're going to have a series of tests. If it meets one of the criteria, it's going to do something with the error message. In the previous case, it created a LI tag or the start of an LI tag. And we're going to set that be valid to false. And then at the end, we're going to return that value, and whoever called it is going to use that value. Usually to either go ahead and continue the processing or not. So if it's valid, we change the color. What do we do there? We find the two text boxes. We get those elements. And we find the thing that has the ID of changeable. We set its background color and we set its color. So that's something pretty straightforward, something similar to what we've done in previous classes. We then create a LI object. We saw this in the other example too, where we created an image object. The inner HTML is a way to create HTML on a page, but it's better to create your HTML code this way. So I'm creating an LI tag. That's what this instruction does. But that LI tag is sort of floating out in space. All right, it's not on any web page yet. And we create inside that LI tag a text node, or actually, we create the text node. So we create a block of text that says BG equals FG equals, and then we append that text mode to our LI. So that's putting that text that we create here into our LI. Finally, we find the thing on the page that has an ID of history, and we add that LI to our history, which, if you notice, our history is this LI or UL down here. So we're always adding LIs to this. Do you understand what is meant when we talk about children in this case? A children is a tag that is part of another tag. It's a nested tag. So for example, a UL. What are tags inside of ULs? Well, there's LIs. Okay. So LI would be a child of UL. So if we say append a child here, what we're doing is we're taking that LI that we just created and we're putting that, appending it. So we're putting it at the end of the list of all the other children for that history list. And that is creating then an unordered list that has these things in order. All right, clear history. That is pretty much what the code had before. Click that button to clear history, we call clear history. And we go and we iterate through and loop through and remove all the children as long as there is a child in that history list. So we find the history list. We look to see if it has a first child. Because if it doesn't have a first child, it means it's empty. So as long as there's a first child, so as long as there's something in it, we're going to remove that first child. And we're going to repeat this over and over again as long as there is something in that first child position for that UL. Are there any questions on this? Now let's go back to your assignment. And let's talk about the different pieces of it and what's the same of what we discussed today and what's different. Doing this calculation, pulling the data from here and here, is pretty straightforward. It is only slightly different than what we've done in class today. Not saying it's identical, but it's slightly different than what we've done in class today. My suggestion for you in working on this is to do this first. Get that working. So you'll have something that when you click the button, you'll validate those fields, just like we validated fields in these two examples. If it's valid, then you'll go ahead and process it. Process it will take and do the calculation, get the value of how much a penny is, get the number of coins, and do the calculation and display the calculation on the page. This is usually the part that people find tricky. And my suggestion on this is to start by displaying one image, but display the proper image. So if they pick pennies, show 1 penny. That isn't terribly different than what we've had today, because we've displayed 1 check mark or 1 X. So we can display 1 penny or 1 nickel or 1 dime or 1 quarter in there. Then we need a loop. All right. Then we need a loop to repeat as many as the number of times are. So what are for loops? I don't know if we've seen a for loop in this class. A for loop works kind of like this. You may have seen these in C# because they're the same there, or even in Java. This is a for loop, and this will repeat the block of code that's included in the for loop. And what is that saying? That's saying we're going to start off with a variable called I that initially is equal to 0. We're going to repeat this block of code over and over again. And each time that we repeat it, we're going to add 1 to I. So initially I equals 0. And second time through the loop, I will equal 1. Third time through the loop, I will equal 2, and so on. When does this stop? It continues as long as I is less than X. So if X was 4, this loop would execute 4 times. First time through, I has a value of 1. The second time through, I has a value of 2. The third time through, I has a value of 3. The fourth time through, I has a value of, I think I misspoke. 0 the first time, then 1, then 2, then 3. The last time, it'll have a value of 4, and that will cause the loop to stop. So this loop will not execute with I having a value of 4. It will go from 0 through 3. But if you notice, 0 through 3 is 4 instances of the number. So when you figure out how to make 1 image and put it there, put that code in a loop. I would suggest breaking things into functions. Have your process form function that calls the validate function. Have the calculate total amount. Have the display images, both as separate functions. The last thing that you're going to need is when the user clicks on this, you want to clear out this area, because you don't want to add more pennies on top of this, or more dimes or nickels or whatever. You don't want that list to grow with all the images that you have selected so far. You want to start clean with that area each time. So you'll have a function that will clear out this area. And where did we see that function? Saw that function right here. It will loop through and clear out everything that is part of that section. So you'll have a separate section for these images. You also have a separate section for the numerical result. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, that's all I had today. You're welcome to come to lab. We'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week.